In case you don't know, we use Anchor to distribute our podcast. We love it because it's free, there are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and more. There's no minimum listenership to start earning money, if that's a goal for your podcast. And everything you need to make a podcast is in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started creating your own podcast. Hi, this is Cheyenne.
And this is Rachel.
Welcome to What the Finance.
We're so glad you're here.
This week, we're going to talk about history, money. Rachel and I, as everybody knows, we're finance nerds, and I have a friend, Allysse, who's joining us this week that's not so much a finance nerd, but she's a history nerd, and a lot of her history nerd stuff overlaps with money nerd stuff, so we thought we should chat.
Yeah,
thanks for inviting me.
Thanks
I'm
for
excited.
doing the thing. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
Anytime I get a soapbox for history, I gotta take it.
Well, yeah, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
No, and I think more specifically, Allysse, right? Like you are an expert, I would say, in labor unions.
Yeah.
That's I will say that's become my primary focus, is the American labor movement, specifically focusing on Iron Range area, a little bit around Chicago too, since I'm from a suburb of Chicago. And the Haymarket Affair is kind of what got me first interested in labor history. Also, what first got me interested in kind of this idea of labor tying in with social movements, tying in with kind of like further left politics a little bit. So dabble in many things, but yeah, Iron Range labor history is kind of my bread and butter.
So the Hayward movement, right? Is that what you said? I've never.
Oh, Haymarket.
Haymarket. Oh my gosh, thank you.
Yes. No, sorry, it's okay. I forget. Yeah. So, back in the late 1800s, as a lot of immigrants were coming into Chicago, they started their labor movement, and so on May 1st, 1886, in celebration of May Day, or like International Labor Day, and there's a strike going on, and they had a big meeting, and essentially it got broken up and some violence occurred, all that kind of stuff, as it normally does. And then on May 4th, they regathered and they had a lot of speeches. So a gentleman by the name of August Spies, who is German, a German anarchist, was talking amongst others, and essentially a bomb goes off in the middle of this whole crowd, and a couple of police officers were killed during this skirmish. And so a lot of the leaders of this labor movement were basically given a show trial. I mean, it was a joke. And they're hanged. And so the two main leaders are August Spies, but then the other dude is Albert Parsons. And those were the two main leaders. Albert Parsons was from the South, fought in the Civil War, married Lucy Parsons, who was Black, and that was also quite a stir because it was a white dude marrying a Black woman at that time. But so the Haymarket Affair, became national news, and it became this giant rallying symbol for the left at that time. And so many people like Lucy Parsons and others in that fight would eventually go on to create the Industrial Union, the Industrial Workers of the World, in 1905 in Chicago. And so, this whole thing, it's just a lot of things tie back to the Haymarket and Haymarket Affair, Haymarket Riot, however you want to say it. But that was kind of my gateway.
Cool. So as you were talking about that, something that kind of immediately popped into my head is that we started this off with the assumption that everybody understood the connection between why it would make sense to us to ask somebody who who talks about unions and whose work is in unions, how that connects to not only personal finance, but, larger, more in terms of economies and stuff. So can you help kind of connect that for people maybe?
Now, sure. As someone who isn't necessarily like a finance nerd, this would be my connection, right? And how I'm kind of processing this. So again, from an outsider's perspective, in order to really kind of I guess, either invest in things such as like the stock market or in other things, and like be able to save up for big potential ticket items like a house, a car, all that stuff, you need money, right? Well, if you're working jobs that don't pay well, but you're working 40 hours, 60 hours a week, that ties into the labor movement, because without proper representation, a proper voice in the workplace, power in the workplace, democracy in the workplace, you don't have any capital to be able to do any of that finance stuff. To me, right? That this is my kind of overarching connection. So there's kind of that old adage of you have a boss, you need a union. And it's when you have those union jobs and you're able to fight for living wage, that's when you're able to do a lot more of the personal finance stuff and actually have time to do that. Because so many times people are working hours upon hours to make ends meet, and they don't have anything extra to either invest or to save for retirement or any of that stuff. Well, and so many people too, right? So there's like that backlash of, well, just budget better, or just, all of that, where I think it's Representative Katie Porter actually then like outlines like, no, they don't, like, this is what you would make and these are what your expenditures are. It's not a matter of planning or budgeting. It's a matter of paying your people a livable wage.
Right. Didn't they do a thing, I want to say within the last 5 years, in which they were trying to figure out, like, Walmart, Walmart was the example that they used, and basically they came up with a number that if Walmart was going to pay all of their employees a fair livable wage, they would have to increase their prices. That was their argument, was they were going to have to increase their prices. And somebody like went through and did the math and was like, you would have to increase the prices on all of your products by like 10 cents to pay your workers a livable wage. Walmart was
that's actually a big argument right now too, of, well, we can't raise the minimum wage because then prices would go up. Prices are going up regardless. Like, if you know, like, the trend is just, it keeps going up, but if people's wages are keep going, like, it doesn't tie with ties don't keep going. Because I think it was like, if minimum wage had stayed with inflation since like the 70s, it would be well over $20 an hour right now.
I think close to
instead
20.
of $7.25. So
I
I don't know, I hope that ties into this. It's never questioned, and I know this is kind of another talking point, but like, it's never questioned, why are the CEOs making that much? Or like that could easily factor into paying people a livable wage. Like, why? I think so. The labor exhibit that we had recently put in at the museum, we had the stat of, at the point of the stat, I think it was like 2017, 2016, something like that. CEOs made 385 times more than an average employee, like across kind of that whole spectrum. And there's no way, you can't tell me that a CEO works 385 times more than an average worker. So it's a problem.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
What was the company a couple of years ago?
I'm super interested in this company. It's Gravity Payments. The minimum wage for an employee at that company is $70,000 a year. People do make more than that. Like, that's the floor. And actually, he came out a few days ago when Rush Limbaugh died. He grew up in a really conservative home, and where they worship Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh slammed his company on his radio show, saying they were going to go out of business, and that better be a case study, at Harvard and all those places, not to run your business. But they're actually doing awesome.
Yep.
Right.
And they are a case study, at Harvard Business School and all those other Ivy League places on how you ought to run your business.
It's not impossible.
No.
Right. And that's exactly it. It's frustrating because it is totally possible to do.
Right.
It's just that, people are sometimes selfish.
A little bit.
Yeah. Basically.
A little bit.
So circling back to the labor movement.
Yeah.
Taken off.
Yeah.
So we've got Lucy Parsons, Black woman. I would hypothesize that maybe part of the reason that the labor movement from that angle had a hard time maybe getting moving was because it was being headed up by a Black woman right? And there's that intersection of, racism and sexism.
Yes.
Which is also, right, unions that help women, maybe a lot more than they help men. Because of that piece of wage inequality. Would you say that guess is correct? Or am I just like talking like a crazy person?
So that's so yeah, in the beginning of the late 1800s, right? So 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, you had the formation of the AFL, which is the American Federation of Labor. And they were very much focused on craft unionism, so only organizing around a particular job. They actually called immigrants unorganizable, and didn't want women, very problematic. So in comes people like Lucy Parsons, Mary Mother Jones, Eugene Debs, all of those types of people came together, and they, like I mentioned before, the industrial workers of the world, their whole thing was, regardless of what you do, we're all stronger together. And they have this big image of kind of everyone raising a fist, and then there's this giant fist, right? So if everyone comes together, it's that solidarity aspect. And so the IWW is actually one of the first unions to organize immigrants, to organize women, and to organize people of color. And this is particularly seen out east at places like the Patterson Silk Strike, the Lawrence Textile Strike in the 19 teens, and then up here on the Iron Range in the 1916 strike. Also, the IWW had a big movement in the 30s down with sharecroppers in the South. So, because for them, and granted, individuals might have still had their own stereotypes and, that type of thing, but as an organization, their whole point was to unite the working class. And so, but as time progresses and the IWW kind of was snuffed out, and then you get your major kind of the 1930s to 1940s, you get this business unionism model where I would kind of argue they almost become what they were fighting against a little bit, where they're spending more time fighting it or like lobbying in Washington versus kind of that grassroots boots on the ground type of structure. And then they became very insulated and focusing more on kind of that classic white man unionism type of thing. But now you have, and so for a lot of people of color, I mean, James Baldwin even has a quote of saying like, I'm a worker, but you won't let me in your union. So there is a history of that. I mean, and then actually, so recently we were doing some filming at work, and I was talking to the videographer, and he was working with a group up on the Iron Range that this summer had done some, that intersection of, racism and police. And he was talking a little bit about the labor movement with them, and they had a very not positive take on it because of police unions. And I'm like, that I wouldn't. I just assumed that they wouldn't be cool about it because, again, it's stereotypically that white blue collar dude that the media always portrays as just racist, and you write them off. Versus this whole pressure of police unions. Sorry, I'm kind of getting a little off topic here, but it was just kind of this interesting, I mean, the labor movement itself is very kind of up and down in terms of problematic nature and whatnot. And I think part of that does have to do with the fact that it tied itself to Washington, D.C., I should say, in like the 30s and 40s. And it tied itself to a political party, the Democratic Party, rather than becoming a party itself. So if you look at places like Canada or New Zealand or Australia or Great Britain, they all have a Labour Party that is there solely then for working class people. And I mean, granted, I'm not going to get into the history of those individual parties either because I don't really know them that well. But I just think, yeah, that's a big factor in how the labor movement is shaken in the US. Does that answer your question at all?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I know. I can kind of keep going. So, like, if I'm going too long, just kind of give me the cutoff signal and you can rein me in.
Well, I'm thinking through this now is super interesting to me because I am in a union, right? Like I'm employed by the state of Minnesota, and we're all unionized. Despite being in a union, I have mixed feelings about unions.
Sure.
But it had actually never really occurred to me that on the bad side of the mix, might be because of how labor unions are organized in the United States as compared to how they're organized across the world, right? Because in my time of being employed with the state of Minnesota, I've been in a few different unions, right? Because it, you just talked about, right? Like it's broken up by the type of job that you've got.
Right.
The first one I was in, though, you have a 6-month probationary period. And then if you're a bad employee, but you pass the probationary period, it's really hard to get rid of somebody who's a bad employee. But almost anyone can fake being a good employee for 6 months.
Right.
Or they throw the towel in and then you can't let them go.
Right.
I hear that frustration a lot when unions get brought up. And my take on it is that it's not impossible to get rid of somebody. It's not impossible to get rid of a bad employee that's in a union. It is just harder.
And while I can definitely see that, I think because so many states are either at will or are right to work states. So right to work meaning that if a place decides to unionize, you still don't need to join it. The union, however, you can still benefit from the union in your workplace, but you don't have to pay union dues. I think of kind of the positives obviously outweigh the negatives. And I'm not saying that that's what you guys are arguing for or anything like that. But for any listeners that might also have issues with that idea of it makes it harder to fire someone.
Right.
Part of me wants to kind of focus on the standard rather than kind of the what am I trying to say?
I think
the rule rather than the exception. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's
But no, I mean it's kind of like with anything, right? If it has humans in it, it's going to be flawed.
Right.
And I think too, a lot of the nature of, again, speaking with the U.S. stuff, right? The purpose and kind of the main drive for a lot of unions, speaking broadly, shifted again 40s and 50s to focus solely on wages and benefits, and those are two very important things, but they're not everything. So I keep going back to the industrial workers of the world, or the IWW, because they really did embody that social movement of being thought of as a human being in the workplace with the economic side of it. So, and that got lost somewhere. And I think part of it got lost is because a lot of those in the 40s and 50s, a lot of those radicals were expelled from unions, because then eventually you have to, with the McCarthy era, you eventually do have to swear that you're not a communist before you join a union. And, people, I know that can be a trigger word for some people, but they were really good at organizing. They were really good at getting people together who would not have otherwise gotten together. And I think that also had lasting ramifications.
Well, and I guess I would imagine too, with the focus more on unions with wages and benefits, that the bosses that you're organizing against, right, they're saying, oh, well, if we pay you more, then it doesn't matter if you have safe working conditions.
Exactly.
As much.
Yeah.
Right. Like that was the whole idea initially, right?
Sure.
Like union for safe working conditions, and so that children aren't working in factories and things like that.
And actually, I will say this too, when you had mentioned sexism before, I don't know, I didn't even think about this initially. I mean, the first ever class action sexual harassment lawsuit was up here on the Iron Range, Lois Jensen versus EVTAC. And that was also an instance, she also sued the union because the union did not back her up, because the union would not rat on their own with sexual harassment in the workplace. And this was in the 80s and 90s. This wasn't even like 60s, 70s, 50s, whenever. Like this was the 90s. Women were still said that the mines aren't a place for women to be. And I've spoken with her, like I got to hang out with her a couple times, and she's awesome. She still supports the labor movement, because I think I did ask her point blank. I'm like, well, do you still feel like unions are necessary? Like, I just wanted her take on it, right? And she said, I think they are absolutely necessary and they are important, but they still have issues with the fact that and she was a union member. They wouldn't back her and women up. Does that make sense?
I should know this because I am from Evelyn, but I don't. Did she win that sexual harassment lawsuit or no?
Oh yeah, she won.
Okay. Rachel, have you?
I was guessing, but I was like, oh man. Oh.
Yeah, it's okay.
Rachel, have you ever read or watched North Country?
The answer to both of those questions is no.
Oh, it was based on that case.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I will suggest, so also talking with her. Sorry, this is going to be Lois Jensen corner. She liked the movie because she was also heavily like, worked with them a little bit. She does not like the book, and she's pretty open about that. The authors kind of abused a little bit of their insider connections with her and the other women. I mean, the book still has some good info in it. I'm not saying don't read it, but she's more of a fan of the movie for what it's worth.
Noted.
I just personally have this weird dynamic, right? Like I was in high school when they filmed the movie, so like however, growing up, my parents were very anti-rated R movies, which North Country is, and so I didn't see it when it came out because my mom and dad, who had the money and the car, were like, no, see it, and then you keep going, okay, I'm gonna I keep meaning to watch it, and it doesn't rise to the top of the list. So,
yeah.
Despite being an adult who watches rated R movies.
Yeah, I watched it with a friend when I first moved up here. Because I was told that was kind of one of the things, if you want to get a sense of some of it, right? I mean, I know it is still a Hollywood movie, so some things are a little hyperbole, a little. And we watched it. And in the middle of it, there's this one time that Charlize Theron's dad gives a speech at a union meeting, and she needed to pause it and get some ice cream because she started to cry. So it is very emotional. It's very good. It's very emotional. And I looked over at her. She's like, I need a break. And we had to pause it. So it was adorable. It was so funny. But
it's a pretty heavy subject.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And it does really convey a lot of aspects of Iron Range history, which is really interesting too. I mean, the accents alone of that.
If anybody is listening to this and they're thinking, well, I'm not unionized and I want to become unionized so that I have a voice to ask for better wages and better working conditions, how could they get started?
Oh. Well, I will say it is slightly dangerous to do so because depending on where you are, like for example, Walmart has a whistleblower hotline number where if you hear word about unionizing, you call this number immediately. There are these giant firms, right, that come in. They're called labor relations firms. Union firms, like call it what it is. But anyways, getting back to your question, I think it would be, depending on where the person would be, to kind of get a feel of what union might, fit your workplace. And that can be a simple Google search based on, if you're a service worker, in an Amazon warehouse or something like that. I think simple Google search on a couple of different unions, and then they have representatives that you can contact that can then give you more info. And that can kind of help start the process. Oh gosh, you will need, depending on the union, you will then need to go through the process of voting to join, which I think they need, oh gosh, I cannot remember right now. I think it's just a majority to join, right? Okay, thank you. Okay. But then you have to go through the National Labor Relations Board, which is a little problematic as well because positions in the National Labor Relations Board are tied to politics. They're tied to political parties. So a lot can happen between that vote and official union recognition. And some of that would be like employers kind of stymieing the process or dragging it out. So then, because if you don't get certified within 1 year of you voting, you have to do it all over again. And so there's just a lot of different ways that they can prolong it, because in most workplaces, the employers have all the power. And so it's just a very lengthy it's a lengthy process for sure. Like for example, actually down in, I think it's, is it Alabama or Mississippi? I think it's Alabama. Their Amazon warehouse are going to vote. And for the longest time, Amazon was like bringing them to court. Like it's not legal for them to do this. It's, and Amazon is hiring Pinkerton guards, or not guards, but like the Pinkerton agency. That's the boogeyman of like the 1890s and early 1900s of like labor, like union busters who would go in and beat people up, are still around. And then they're still spying in the workplace. I'm sorry, it's just like it I keep thinking like, what year am I in? I can also talk a little bit more about those labor relations firms, because I did a little bit of research on those for Project at Work. And there are these, like I said, these labor relations firms that companies will hire. And normally the consultants get paid about $2,000 a day, more depending on what it is. Come in and essentially do like propaganda PowerPoint presentations and try and again use those code words of, no, we're a family here. The boss is like it's that paternalistic language of companies back in the early 1900s. And so you can find out really like, so there's the Department of Labor has all this information on their website, because legally, if you hire one of these firms, you have to then report it, and you have to basically send in these different types of forms, and then those companies, the labor relations firms, have to send in info as well. So you can search by firm or you can search by company. And I found, I will say, it was kind of a little depressing, because I like to try and support companies that do take care of their workers. And it was a little depressing to see just how many do hire those firms. And I found one for a Las Vegas hotel or casino, or hotel and casino, that was signed by one Donald J. Trump. And he, I think in that instance, in that year, maybe spent $500,000 on union busting, so he wouldn't have to deal with union for his hotel workers, who I'm sure are not paid well.
If they get paid at all.
If they get paid at all, right? Because he is notorious for not paying people, or the entity that surrounds him, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, again, it's a little disheartening. All this, the structure of unions and the labor movement in whole, again, is simply to try and create democracy in the workplace, where then workers together can have their say, a little bit at least, in what they need and what they want. And because sometimes I feel like people forget what the point is a little bit of them, where sure, it is this entity and you do have to pay and do it and all this stuff, but like at the end of the day, just to remind people what it's about.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. You mentioned two things that I wanted to kind of make sure that we really addressed.
Sure.
One was that XYZ company doesn't need a union because it's more like a family instead of an employer.
Right.
And this is something that I've gone back and forth on, because obviously mine and Rachel's ultimate goal would be for What the Finance to be so successful that this is our full-time job. Realistically, is that going to happen? Who knows? But it's definitely like it's a goal for me, at least. I assume it's a goal for Rachel as well.
Yep, that's fair to say.
Okay. And something that I've thought of with that is obviously, she and I could not be unionized, but if we were that successful, I think of employees and the unionizing of our employees, because I do think I'm a little biased to like unions, specifically because of where I was raised. Where I was raised
very much
tells me that unions are a good thing, and I think they are. I can see some concerns that they, from an employer standpoint. I also look at it, and I have never been in a union. And I have worked for places that I think that in general treated their employees overall well.
Okay.
With that said, I do still think that there would be a benefit to unionizing them. So one of the things that I think of is when you're talking about like smaller to medium-sized companies,
right?
Does it make more sense to empower your employees to be like, here, like, and I'm going to keep using Rachel and I as an example, because I think that that's where my brain goes most now. Does it make sense if we ever got to that point where we have 10 or however many employees, if it just makes sense for us to say like, listen, ultimately our goal is always to treat you as fairly as possible, but also like, here, be part of a union, because it's a checks and balance there for us.
Absolutely.
Like, we're never going to go out of our way to be assholes to people, but
we're only
Sure.
human.
we are only
Right.
human. And I think that sometimes unions are a little bit more on the cutting edge, so to speak, of how best to treat employees.
Absolutely. Yeah, because there's plenty of studies of if you work in an industry that is heavily unionized, but you yourself, like in your workplace, aren't, your wages are going to be better off because your industry is heavily unionized. So they force wages to go up, or salaries, whatever you would want to use, wages. Yeah. And I would say in terms of like small businesses, like my stepdad owned his own company. It was very small. And he didn't have his employees unionized, but he also, didn't treat his employees like shit. And if, for example, because the company, how the nature of the company, if their clients hadn't paid or he was behind on collecting payment, he would always pay his employees before he paid himself. Now, is that the standard? No. Have small businesses also been very exploitative? Yes. But I think if you can create a good culture and you kind of recognize that, your employees are humans, that can go a long way. The other thing I will say is I'm going to do a little quick plug on Medicare for All real quick. Because for small business owners, if you're trying to attract people to come work for you, a lot of people aren't going to go anywhere unless they get some bennies, because it's kind of important to have health insurance. If Medicare for All passes, that's one less thing that you as a company have to worry about paying for your employees. And again, because I know that even some of the big unions were against Medicare for All, because they're like, well, we've been fighting for insurance. And it's like, yeah, and you understand how hard that is, right? So like, why are you against everyone having it? And then that frees up your time to do more recruiting, to get, more so yeah, I guess it does depend on the culture that you would want to create in your workplace. And yeah, does that kind of answer your question? I think a little, maybe not, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it did. I think
the other thing, so I am technically part of, this would maybe make sense why I've been talking about them a lot. I'm technically part of the Industrial Workers of the World, because part of their program is that as long as you don't have hiring or firing power, you can join their union, minus cops. They do not allow cops into their union. And you can be kind of like a member at large if you don't have a local in your area. And then so you can plug in and help in various ways. If you wanted, you can basically do whatever you'd want to do. And part of the reason why I joined was I realized, boy, I've gotten a lot of mileage out of researching and talking about the IWW. I might as well send them some dues money to help, because there isn't a local branch where I live. Closest one is about 3 hours away in the Twin Cities. And I've actually met with them on a previous project. So, you could find something like that. IWW also does not go through the National Labor Relations Board because of its bureaucratic nature. So yeah, you could find something like that that's not tied to a bigger entity.
I don't remember what the second thought that I had was, but I just
shoot. I'm sorry, Cheyenne.
No.
I talked too much.
No, I did. I talked too much and lost my train of thought. This happens all the time. So I think that like one of the first things that we talked about at the beginning of this was how are unions and personal finance, which is what Rachel and I talk about all the time, how are those two things connected? And I do think that we kind of answered that in a very...
I'd hope so. Right. I hope.
Yeah.
I hope we did.
So basically, just to summarize what the last, I don't know, what half hour, 40 minutes has been, is essentially unions, I mean, they protect the health and safety of workers in certain industries, but they give them power to protect their financial security as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
basically,
that's how those two things are connected.
Right. Yeah.
If you're
I would say that's a good summary.
A woman, especially a woman of color, being in a union is of a special benefit to you, because then you have an organizing body behind you to help you combat the wage gap.
Right.
Persists.
Right. Very much so.
More than if you were in one of those really sexist companies that calls you a family.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I ran out of all of the little talking points that I had jotted down while we were chatting about this. Rachel, did you have any others?
I don't think so. You keep talking about this forever, but
Same.
I know. I hope this was,
this is
at
awesome.
least relevant to what you guys want to do. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for joining us, Allysse.
Heck yeah.
Awesome. If ever you think of something that you're like, hey, this would be really cool to talk about with them, let us know, because we are always in favor of having
Sure. I could do a little history corner. So thank you again for inviting me.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on.
Yes.
It's a good time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of What the Finance. You can subscribe everywhere you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode.
You can also email us at what_the_finance@protonmail.com. Visit us on Facebook at What the Finance. Follow us on Instagram at What the Finance. Check us out on Pinterest at What the Finance, or tweet us at finance_what.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of What the Finance. It's been fun for us to release these back catalog of episodes, and we hope that you've been enjoying them. Now, don't forget, if you are enjoying these episodes, it would help us out a ton if you would either subscribe to our YouTube channel or subscribe to the podcast anywhere that you listen to podcasts so that you never miss an episode.